The Supreme Court has issued a ruling on ghost guns.
This is one of the biggest decisions of the term that we've been waiting on.
A piece of metal with no serial number sitting on a kitchen table can change the entire landscape of constitutional law, federal power, and public safety overnight. When the highest court in the United States delivered a sweeping verdict on untraceable firearm kits, most legal analysts assumed the battle lines had hardened permanently, leaving federal regulators in total control over how modern weaponry is manufactured, tracked, and sold across the country. Yet beneath the surface of that high-stakes judicial chess match, a quieter, much deeper legal detonation was already being prepared. In a federal courtroom in Texas, setting up a direct collision course between executive overreach and centuries-old traditions of personal fabrication. What followed was a judicial twist that caught the Department of Justice entirely off guard, proving that a single stroke of a pen by a district judge could completely unravel years of regulatory enforcement and throw the entire definition of a firearm back into absolute chaos. To understand how a court in Fort Worth could challenge a framework that had just survived the scrutiny of the Supreme Court, we have to look back at the mechanics of how federal agencies stretch statutory definitions to fit modern technology. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, commonly known as the ATF, operating under the executive directives of the Joe Biden administration, looked at the explosive rise of do-it-yourself weapon parts and recognized a massive regulatory loophole. For years, companies had been selling unfinished frames, receivers, and modular parts kits online or through the mail, without serial numbers or background check mandates, allowing buyers to assemble functional, fully operational firearms at home within minutes, using standard workshop tools.
What are ghost guns? Those are those unregulated, do-it-yourself guns that people can buy on the internet and put the pieces together, they're unassembled, and turn it into a gun. There are no background checks for these kind of weapons. You can lie about your age. If you're 16 or a criminal, you can get one. There are no serial numbers.
To close this gap, the agency enacted a comprehensive regulatory overhaul in 2022, officially redefining weapon parts kits and partially complete components as statutory firearms under the vintage framework of the 1968 Gun Control Act. Commercial manufacturers of these kits were suddenly forced to stamp serial numbers onto metal blocks, obtain federal licenses, and subject every single purchaser to mandatory background checks, transforming an unregulated market into a tightly monitored commercial grid. Naturally, this aggressive reinterpretation did not go uncontested, triggering an immediate and ferocious legal crusade led by gun rights advocacy groups like the Second Amendment Foundation and specialized manufacturing firms such as Defense Distributed. The plaintiffs argued that an administrative agency cannot simply rewrite federal statutes or invent new legal definitions out of thin air, just to target products that Congress never explicitly authorized them to control. The legal challenge moved swiftly through the federal court system, landing squarely in front of U.S. District Judge Reed O'Connor, a jurist appointed by former President George W. Bush, who has a long track record of scrutinizing federal executive expansion. Judge O'Connor initially sided with the challengers, issuing rulings that blocked the implementation of the rule and declaring that the agency had overstepped its legal boundaries, but the federal government refused to back down, utilizing emergency appellate mechanisms to keep the rules alive, while the case worked its way up the judicial ladder toward the nation's highest tribunal, setting the stage for a landmark showdown over administrative power. The tension reached a boiling point when the U.S. Supreme Court took up the central question of whether weapon parts kits could legally be classified as firearms under the existing text of the 1968 statute. In a surprising 7-2 majority opinion authored by Justice Neil Gorsuch, the Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favor of the government, concluding that the ATF's regulations were not facially inconsistent with the underlying law.
The court upholding restrictions put in place by the Biden administration on so-called ghost guns.
The Supreme Court ruled today to uphold regulations on ghost guns.
The Supreme Court upheld Biden-era regulations on so-called ghost guns.
The Supreme Court has ruled to uphold Biden-era regulations.
The majority reasoned that the statutory definition of a firearm was broad enough to encompass components designed to be readily converted into working weapons, dealing a major defeat to the commercial manufacturers of untraceable kits. For gun control organizations like Everytown Law, the decision was hailed as an essential victory for public safety, ensuring that DIY kits could not bypass the foundational background check infrastructure designed to keep dangerous weapons out of the hands of prohibited individuals. Yet, beneath the celebration of that Supreme Court victory, a crucial legal nuance remained entirely unaddressed. The court had evaluated the case strictly through the lens of administrative law and statutory authority, completely bypassing the deeper, more foundational constitutional questions regarding the Second and Fifth Amendments. Recognizing that the door was still wide open, the legal teams representing defense distributed, and the Second Amendment Foundation immediately marched right back into Judge Reed O'Connor's courtroom in Texas. They argued that while the Supreme Court had confirmed the agency's statutory authority to interpret the Gun Control Act, it had never ruled on whether restricting access to raw components and home gunsmithing violated a citizen's fundamental constitutional rights. This strategic pivot shifted the battleground away from narrow administrative procedures and straight into the heart of constitutional law, forcing the judiciary to weigh modern public safety mandates against historical traditions of self-reliance. The plaintiffs contended that the federal government was effectively criminalizing the age-old American tradition of manufacturing and repairing one's own personal firearms, a practice that predated the founding of the republic itself and formed the bedrock of early colonial self-sufficiency. When Judge O'Connor issued his subsequent ruling, it sent shockwaves through the legal community, completely upending the narrative that the ghost gun debate had been settled by the Supreme Court. The federal judge declared the Biden-era regulation entirely unconstitutional, ruling that it directly infringes upon the right to keep and bear arms guaranteed by the Second Amendment. Furthermore, O'Connor struck down the framework on Fifth Amendment due process grounds, asserting that the terminology and vague enforcement metrics utilized by the agency failed to provide clear legal notice to citizens, making ordinary mechanical assembly an administrative minefield. In his written opinion, the judge emphasized that self-manufacturing firearms has historically been a foundational element of American life, noting that the restriction of necessary components creates an unconstitutional barrier to a protected right. The ruling specifically blocked the federal government from enforcing the contested regulations against defense distributed and the active members of the Second Amendment Foundation regarding specific product lines, delivering a massive tactical win to the gun rights coalition. The legal fallout from Judge O'Connor's decision instantly reignited a fierce ideological war across the country, highlighting the stark divide over how the Constitution applies to modern manufacturing technology. Representatives for gun control advocacy groups like Everytown Law wasted no time condemning the ruling, labeling it egregiously wrong and publicly urging the U.S. Department of Justice to launch an immediate and aggressive appeal to restore federal oversight. They argued that allowing the widespread distribution of untraceable, unserialized weapon kits creates an unmonitored loophole that directly undermines public safety and evades critical background check protocols. On the other side of the aisle, executives from organizations like the Second Amendment Foundation celebrated the decision as a vital defense of individual liberty, praising the court for dismantling what they characterized as an overreaching and confusing bureaucratic mess. As the legal dust settles on this latest chapter, the future of federal firearms regulation hangs delicately in the balance, awaiting the inevitable next move from appellate courts and government litigators. Although the Department of Justice under the administration of Donald Trump has historically championed broader interpretations of gun ownership rights, government attorneys had paradoxically defended the underlying ghost gun framework during earlier phases of the litigation, leaving the exact trajectory of an upcoming appeal shrouded in uncertainty. Whether higher appellate courts will uphold Judge O'Connor's constitutional blockade or reinstate the federal agency's licensing and serialization mandates remains one of the most volatile legal questions in the nation today. What is absolutely clear, however, is that the ongoing clash between technological innovation, individual constitutional rights, and federal regulatory power is far from over, ensuring that the legal status of untraceable components will remain a focal point of intense national debate for years to come. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.